Welcome to another Tempo Storm Meta Snapshot breakdown. A little over a week ago, Blizzard released a balance patch toning down several different cards. A lot of the top decks were nerfed, and some of the ones in the middle of the pack were touched upon preemptively. For better or for worse, the meta has changed and feels significantly more balanced now. Many players are flocking towards Rogue, as its classic sets help to carry the class above the rest. In fact, some players are even calling for some of these cards to be nerfed or Hall of Famed. Interestingly enough, the entirety of Tier 1 and Tier 2 are comprised of either Highlander or GALAKROND decks, showing just how strong these mechanics are. Over the course of the next month, the new adventure, GALAKROND's Awakening, will be releasing cards, slowly shaking up the meta with each week. It's impossible to say how much of an impact these cards will have now, but we're excited to see where the metagame goes. Before we take a deeper look into how the meta is shaping up, make sure to subscribe to our channel to keep up with all of our different Hearthstone content. Now let's begin by jumping into Tier 1. Leading the meta is Tempo Rogue. This archetype jumped up from Tier 2 and swiftly took a spot in Tier 1. As we mentioned before, Rogue's classic set propels it above the other classes thanks to how versatile and strong its cards are. On top of that, the class always finds a way to adjust to the meta, giving Rogue a way to take advantage of new and unrefined decks. In the previous nerfs, Rogue only lost Necrim Apothecary, leaving other Rogue decks to continue to dominate the meta. Opposed to running the Death Rattle Necrim package, this archetype now dives into the GALAKROND pool. As it stands, Tempo Rogue performs best against slower decks that struggle to take board early. Good examples of this are Highlander Mage and GALAKROND Warrior, as they both need time to get their game plan online. As for bad matchups, Tempo Rogue really only struggles against one Tier 2 deck, which is GALAKROND Control Warlock. This matchup isn't horrendous, with the Rogue's win rate being around 45%, but the Warlock is well equipped to deal with all of this archetype's threats. Second in Tier 2 is another Rogue archetype with Highlander Rogue. This deck trades the consistency of having multiples of the good Rogue cards for the powerful Highlander synergies. Being able to have access to Zephrys the Great and Dragon Queen Alexstrasza can give any deck a large amount of potential. Thanks to Shadow Step, sometimes you'll be able to play Zephrys twice in a game, which often will be enough to win the game on its own. As with Tempo Rogue, this deck also features a GALAKROND package. In the current metagame, Highlander decks and GALAKROND decks tend to be very powerful, so when put together, they can do crazy things at times. Highlander Rogue does best against Highlander Mage. The Mage can struggle to put on enough pressure to stop the Rogue before they reach their late game power turns. In terms of bad matchups, pure aggressive decks would be the worst for Highlander Rogue, such as Face Hunter. The last deck finding itself in Tier 1 in this meta snapshot is the first non-rogue deck with Highlander Hunter. This archetype continues on the trend of making use of the powerful Highlander cards that were recently released. Hunter is a good class to run Highlander cards thanks to not only its class's unique Highlander card, but also due to how versatile a lot of the cards are that the class can play. You can easily opt between the standard secret list, which we're currently featuring, or even choose to run a more minion-heavy list, depending on what the current meta is. Highlander Hunter has a fantastic matchup against both Highlander Mage and GALAKROND Control Warlock. Hunter typically can pressure control decks out very well, thanks to both its large burst and its hero power to constantly apply pressure. When it comes to bad matchups, Highlander Hunter typically has a rough time with decks that are heavily aggressive, such as Face Hunter or Mech Paladin. It seems most Highlander decks can struggle against these types of decks due to the lack of consistency in answers, which is what happens when you can only run single copies of cards. Now that we took a look at the best decks of the meta, let's take a look at the ones that are trailing slightly behind. There are currently 3 decks in Tier 2 in this meta snapshot. All of these decks are extremely powerful, but are just slightly too weak to be considered Tier 1. At the forefront of Tier 2 is GALAKROND Control Warlock. This archetype was previously known as a few different things, such as Monsanto Warlock, but recently has evolved into the deck it is today. While the deck is pretty different from the one Monsanto originally built, it needed the first variation as a stepping stone to get where it is today. This archetype plays out like a mid-range Warlock deck, making use of the class's survival tools alongside all of the class's GALAKROND synergies. Once it makes it to the late game, it aims to close the game out with either GALAKROND as a finisher or Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. Despite the archetype not being a Highlander-based one, the majority of players run both Zephrys and Alexstrasza due to how often you're cycling through the entirety of your deck. This form of Warlock excels against GALAKROND Warrior. This Warlock deck was made to beat decks like the Warrior, making this a solid matchup. Every deck has bad matchups though, and GALAKROND Control Warlock is no exception. This deck can find itself struggling against Highlander Mage Mage due to the Mage's ability to outlast the Warlock. Highlander Mage is one of the only archetypes that can compete with the Warlock's removals while continuing to apply pressure. Next up within this tier is the previously mentioned Highlander Mage. This archetype is a very well-rounded one that can easily take advantage of the weaker decks. Despite struggling against a lot of the top decks, it has its place in the meta and is one of the reasons the previously mentioned Warlock deck is only in tier 2. Highlander Mage's best matchup comes from GALAKROND control Warlock, as the Mage is well suited to deal with all of its threats while applying pressure of its own. If the Mage ever finds itself in a really bad position, it even has Puzzle Box to maybe sneak its way out of it. As for bad matchups, Highlander Hunter can be a huge problem for this Mage deck. Hunter as an archetype has historically been good against slower forms of Mage, and this time is no different. If the Mage can develop threats of their own onto an empty board, then they can find a win, but otherwise it can be difficult as outlasting a Hunter is nearly impossible. The last deck we'll be taking a look at in tier 2 in this meta snapshot is GALAKROND Warrior. Following the nerf to Scion of Ruin, GALAKROND Warrior lost a decent bit of its power. Many players previously saw this archetype as the best deck in the meta, but with the nerfs it lost some of its power. Make no mistake, this deck is still one of the strongest ones in the game, but it lacks the versatility it did previously. GALAKROND Warrior has a good matchup against Highlander Mage, while struggling against other GALAKROND decks such as GALAKROND control Warlock. Depending on how the meta shifts following the release of the adventure, this deck could rise significantly or even fall down to tier 3 due to it being so close between both tiers. As with every meta snapshot breakdown, we here at Tempo Storm have a deck for you to try out if you want to gain an edge against the top meta decks. In the current meta, a lot of matchups feel very even, with both sides having an equal chance to win if they draw their key card. This can make it difficult to gain an advantage in the meta, but we have an answer for you. If you're playing against a lot of Rogue and Highlander Hunter, we suggest picking up Face Hunter. This archetype finds itself in tier 3, but make no mistake, it can be an explosive deck. Pun intended. At the highest ranks of Legend, this deck will find itself going even against some of the Rogue decks and beating Highlander Hunter consistently, but this requires the Rogue to play perfectly. It's unlikely for you to see people playing their deck perfectly even in Legend, so this matchup is more often than not favored for the Face Hunter. Let us know how this deck does for you when you're smorking people down on the ladder. That wraps up our meta snapshot breakdown. The meta has come a long way since the balance changes and will continue to develop with the release of each wing of the new adventure. We're extremely excited to see where the meta ends up in the coming weeks, and we are sure that you are too. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can be kept in the loop of all the latest meta developments. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.